What's up everybody? If you had to name one Overwatch game mechanic which is unequivocally necessary in just about every situation, what would it be? Assuming you saw the title and thumbnail of this video, then you probably know that the answer I'm looking for is barriers. Whether you love or hate them, barriers have become a fundamentally irreplaceable element in just about every Overwatch match. So much so that even to us tank mains, it's evident that they might be just a bit too powerful. But why exactly have barrier tanks become so domineering? And more importantly, what can Blizzard do to better balance and diversify the tank role moving forward? This is Master Ian Gamer, and let's get into it. Before we dive into the video though, first I want to give a shout out to today's sponsor. The BenQ screen bar monitor lamp is the best way to light up your desk space for any and all situations. Unlike other bulky space-wasting desk lamps, the screen bar's simple weighted clip design lets you effortlessly attach it to the top of any monitor, and the LED lighting is designed specifically to maximize desktop luminescence while reducing eye strain and screen glare. It even includes brightness and temperature adjustments, which can easily be controlled through the touch buttons on top, or an auto adjust setting which conveniently acclimates based on the lighting in your room.
Systems optimized.
Yes, the BenQ screen bar is the perfect desk lamp for working, gaming, YouTube binging, and any other desktop activities. If you're interested in getting your own space-saving screen bar monitor lamp, then check out the Amazon link down in the description. Doing so also supports my channel, which in the industry is what's called a pro gamer move. So thanks again to BenQ for the sponsorship, and now onto the video. I've personally been a tank main since pretty much the very beginning. However, over the years, I've begun to notice one tank mechanic in particular which seems to only become more and more troublesome, and that's, of course, barriers. These days, in 99% of all situations, regardless of map or team composition, you're going to need a barrier tank. The utility of this mechanic is unparalleled, and even upon the most basic examination, it's easy to see why. The job of a tank, particularly a main tank, is to create space for their DPS and supports to operate. There's a few different methods of doing this, but the one which has stood out as being by far the most effective is simply placing a translucent wall between yourself and the enemy, which blocks enemy fire without obstructing your own. On paper, this sounds like a pretty good ability, but in practice, it's even better. Barrier tanks are literally capable of creating portable safe zones that block almost all types of damage from hitting your team. If the enemy can't hurt you, they can't get a kill. And if they can't get a kill, you essentially win. To some extent, you could almost argue that barrier tanks have more in common with the map than the other actual heroes on your team. Barriers serve as a utility for your teammates, and oftentimes the most effective way to consider their presence is in the same way that you'd consider high ground or a choke point. Their location and area control influences how the DPS and supports can operate, so to that extent, starting around without a barrier tank can be likened to starting around without advantageous high ground or choke points. And even if you don't end up utilizing these map advantages in every scenario, it's still better going into a match knowing that you're going to be safe rather than sorry. Now, to be honest, there's nothing inherently wrong with barriers working like this. I, for one, actually kind of enjoy the idea of playing as part of the map. But the issue arises from the fact that this kind of utility is currently uncontested by other Overwatch mechanics. Just because it's an enjoyable playstyle doesn't mean it should be the only playstyle for main tanks. And while technically it isn't if you factor in Wrecking Ball, the fact still stands that barriers are too effective to ever not be used outside of only the most niche situations. It's because of this consistent overbearing effectiveness that we see them used so frequently. Now, there are counters to barriers. In theory, high damage output, flankers, and melee are all effective tools for combating them, but in reality, these counters often end up only further emphasizing the need for barrier main tanks. Without a barrier, all that high damage would end up hitting your teammates, you wouldn't be able to protect your front while dealing with the flanker behind you, and it's hard for melee-based enemies to receive healing and support from their teammates when they're trying to fight you through a barrier. So at the end of the day, playing a barrier into a barrier counter is still more effective than not playing a barrier. If you need any more proof of the sheer necessity litany of barrier tanks, look no further than the tank heroes who've released since Overwatch launched. All 3 of them have been main tanks, with Wrecking Ball being the only main tank in the entire game who doesn't utilize a barrier. Because of this, tanks have arguably had the least amount of post-launch diversity out of all 3 roles. But at the same time, these 3 new main tanks have been necessary. What were people asking for prior to the release of Sigma? A new main tank. What were people asking for prior to the release of Wrecking Ball? A new main tank. And what were people asking for prior to the release of Orisa? A new main tank. Even with Blizzard continuing to add new main tanks, the demand for this specific subclass has seemingly never been satiated. But why? Well, simply put, main tanks are the most important kind of tank, due almost entirely to their barriers. Prior to the introduction of role queue in 2.2.2, if you were ever stuck with only one tank hero on your team, it had to be a main tank. For many tank players, this wasn't really so bad, but when the list of viable tanks you could play was cut down like this to exclude off tanks, the handful of remaining options made the role overall tend to get very boring very quickly. The only other Overwatch mechanic which even comes close to this level of necessity is healing, but given that every support hero at this point offers some amount of healing potential, it's not nearly as restricting as barriers with tanks. And this is why there's always been a demand for more main tanks. Most players don't necessarily mind that the game is designed around needing a main tank, but the least Blizzard could do is offer more options to help diversify and keep the role fresh. And so far, they've largely done this through just adding more barrier tanks. However, where has this brought us?
Surprise!
That's right, double barrier. While it's still too early to tell exactly how powerful this comp will be in the long run, the fact that we're already seeing Sigma-Orisa tank duos being used to such great effect could spell trouble. If nothing else, the advent of double barrier comps is what finally proved to me that something needs to change. Unfortunately though, as it stands, the barrier problem doesn't have a simple solution. The current route Blizzard seems to be taking is just add more barrier tank variety. By adding heroes like Sigma and Orisa, it gives tank players more options without needing to actually adjust the power of barriers. However, this is more of a band-aid solution than an actual fix. It's treating the symptom, which is limited tank viability, instead of the actual problem of barriers being too powerful. And because of this, they've now brought about the rise of double barrier comps in 2.2.2 while failing to actually introduce anything fundamentally new to the way main tanks do their job. One suggestion I've seen is for Blizzard to outright nerf barriers or barrier tanks in general. This could either be done directly by reducing the health or overall effectiveness of barriers, or indirectly by buffing the heroes that counter them. While this most likely would bring about the power shift we want, it'd also have a devastating collateral side effect, which is that main tanks will become even less desirable to play. An important side note to bring up at this point is that despite how powerful barriers are, tanks are still generally the least favored role for any given player. While the exact reason for this likely varies from player to player, I'd hazard that the overarching issue is a combination of how monotonous the role can be in combination with the high expectations that often get placed on these players. Main tank is arguably the most stressful role in the game due to how important it is, and we saw this issue almost reach a breaking point at the height of the stun meta. It's thankfully normalized again since then, especially following the addition of Sigma, but the fragile nature of wanting to play main tank is something that has to be taken seriously. Only nerfing barriers would likely garner the same results as the stun meta, where main tanks are still critical, but a nightmare to actually play. There is one fix I've come up with though, which would alleviate the power imbalance of barriers without making tanks a pain to play. But unfortunately, it's multifaceted and would be very complicated to implement. The first facet requires Blizzard to introduce more non-barrier main tanks. This may sound pretty straightforward, but it's much easier said than done. I think the struggle to conceive of non-barrier tanking mechanics is exceptionally difficult because of how deeply ingrained barriers have historically been in the game. At no point have barriers ever not been meta, so to an extent, the entire mentality behind playing Overwatch, regardless of what role or skill level you're in, is based around the existence of these bulky damage blocking shields. Even considering Wrecking Ball, he's a fairly rare outlier and is oftentimes difficult for uncoordinated teams to even work with. The second facet to my solution though is to introduce more barrier counters. As I said, counters do already exist in game. However, the reality of how they function is that they really only further the necessity of barriers. That's why the game needs proper barrier hard counters. I'm talking hero kits and abilities which straight up ignore the barrier entirely. We already get this a little bit with melee heroes like Doomfist and Brigitte, or even some special abilities like Moira's Orbs and Coalescence. But there needs to be more. The next DPS hero that gets added needs to have ranged damage which can ignore barriers like the old version of Symmetra's Photon Projector. This new DPS should be powerful enough at negating barriers to the point that it actually deters the use of Reinhardt or Orisa when it's on the enemy team. It can't just make playing barrier tanks more annoying, but actually encourage something else to be played. Now, I realize that this kind of DPS sounds like a horrifying, terrible idea in the game's current state, and it is. That's why both facets of this fix need to happen simultaneously. If you add a barrier hard counter before one or more viable non-barrier main tanks, it'd spell hell for the tank players in general. If you add the non-barrier tank before the barrier hard counter, then that tank hero will be comparatively worthless until an effective counter gets added. In order for this to work without creating 4 months of suffering for one or more heroes, the two would need to be released at the same time. The only problem with this though is that Blizzard will never release 2 post-launch heroes at the same time. I know people always get their hopes up for this to be the case every time a major event like BlizzCon rolls around, but from a marketing, balance, and development timeline perspective, it's simply infeasible and we should not be getting our hopes up for it to ever happen. However, there are a couple slight variations to this solution of mine which may work to circumvent the hero release limitation. Instead of releasing 2 heroes at once, only 1 hero gets released and existing heroes are tweaked, balanced, or potentially even reworked to accommodate it. Let's say the non-barrier tank was introduced first. Existing barrier counters, such as Doomfist, could be tweaked a bit so as to impose more pressure on the existing barrier tanks. Doing this could help to balance out the main tank role and open up situations in which the non-barrier tank could be useful. Alternatively, the barrier counter DPS could be added first, but they might be designed in such a way so that they themselves are countered by off tanks. If nothing else, this could help prevent existing off tanks from getting pushed out entirely by double barrier comps. Or maybe running this new DPS would even open up viability for double off tank compositions, or at least more tank duos which make use of Wrecking Ball. Of course, ideally this new DPS wouldn't be so strong as to make barrier tanks completely useless, but rather they'd be balanced to a point where, in the right player's hands, they could more effectively deter barrier play than anything we have in game currently. And let me be clear, I am not talking about Brig 1.0 levels of broken and overpowered countering capabilities. I'm talking about a hero kit that's reasonably balanced and also introduces effective new countering mechanics. Until this kind of real resistance is added, we're never going to see a meta where main tanks use anything other than barriers. Thankfully though, I am currently working on some hero concepts for both non-barrier main tanks and barrier countering DPS heroes. I don't think any of these will be the next hero concept video I upload, as I've already got a different one that's pretty far along, but I will be trying to get some more released in the near future. So stay tuned to my channel for that, and in the meantime, feel free to check out some of my existing hero concepts. I'll have them linked in the description as well as the cards on screen. So as we can see, while barriers aren't inherently broken as a mechanic, the lack of effective counters and non-barrier tank alternatives has resulted in this one mechanic holding near total control over how Overwatch is played. I don't think any of the existing barrier tanks should be removed or even changed really, but going forward, we need to see some more variety. One of the best things about Overwatch is how diverse and interesting its heroes and gameplay mechanics are, and barriers in and of themselves are an excellent example of this. But when it comes to tanks, Blizzard seems to be really hung up on this one mechanic, and if we don't see things changing or evolving past it soon, the tank role will will only become less and less appealing to the greater player base, while simultaneously imposing broken, unfun tank metas. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on barrier tanks and their current state in Overwatch, so be sure to drop a comment down below. And don't forget to support my channel through checking out the BenQ screen bar monitor lamp via the link in the description. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and share it with a friend if you really liked it. Subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and hit up the bell to never miss any of my future Overwatch content. This is Master Ian Gamer signing off, and until next time, have a great day.